Greetings, everybody. Welcome to my quarantine classroom. We're going to talk about another gerrymandering case today, and this one has to do with race. Remember, Baker versus Carr in 1962 had to deal with more geography. Okay, and remember that one was about basically came down to, and you've got to remember this. When you think of Baker versus Carr, think of one person, one vote. Okay. One of the most important court cases to make sure that we are all equally represented in our state legislatures and in the U.S. Congress. Okay, so today's case is going to be about race, and it's from 1993. Okay, before we get to that, let's talk a little bit about the election. Okay, so today's November 6th, and as it stands, we are still without a presidential candidate reaching the 270 mark. Okay, and now I know the closest is Joe Biden. If he wins Nevada, he has exactly the number required, 270. Okay, and then you'll see that they'll declare the winner, and the Biden team will declare victory. But then nothing's going to happen at that point. We won't have a president-elect, and the reason is because there is litigation. There are lawsuits that have been filed in 4 states, Nevada being one of them, and then you have Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. That's the 4 I know of. There might be more in North Carolina and Georgia. So what's going to happen is these cases will be expedited through the court system, and so they will be heard very quickly and decided upon. Okay, now we've been here before, so this isn't like we're in uncharted territory. 20 years ago, we went through this in 2000, and in that election, it was just one state. It was the state of Florida, and it went through the state court system there. It went to the Florida State Supreme Court, and then it was appealed again, and then it went to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's where it was decided, and George W. Bush became the president. Okay, so expect that to happen. Okay, it'll go through the court system of those states, and then from those state Supreme Courts, if it goes that far, it will be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. So I would predict, my prediction is that one or more of these states, at least one, maybe all 4, I don't know, will be decided in the U.S. Supreme Court, just like it was in Florida. Okay, so it does seem like it's a mess, but remember, we have to make sure a fair process is carried out. Otherwise, I mean, it doesn't matter how this election works out and who the next president is. Remember, because of our divided nature, the divided nature of our politics, there's going to be half the country that is upset and half that is pleased. Okay, but it's going to be an easier pill to swallow with the people that are upset about the results if the court cases and the process, the whole equality process is played out. So we have to do that. And remember, both sides are arguing from a perspective of fairness. Okay, the Biden team is saying that every vote should count in America, and we have to make sure all the people that did mail-in voting, those votes count. And remember, in some of these states where it's being litigated, is that in those state laws, they were not able to start mail-in voting until the day of the election, or maybe the day before. And so that's like, in some of these states, hundreds of thousands of ballots that need to be counted. And remember, this is not a typical year. COVID-19 basically made it so a lot of people wanted to do early voting with mail-in voting because they didn't know what it was going to look like in November if they'd be able to go vote, and they wanted to make sure they got their vote in. Okay, so that's the Biden perspective. The Trump perspective is that they want to make sure that because there was delay in counting and that there's been a long process of trying to count the votes, that there's been no fraud involved. Okay, that there weren't double counts, that the people that registered to vote were actually registered, and so they want to make sure that it was fair as far as it wasn't lopsided, there was no fraudulent actions being taken. So remember, both sides have a perspective of fairness, and so from here it's going to be really, it's kind of like a persuasion game. It really is, and we'll see. It is going to be probably a long, drawn-out process. I would say we're not going to know who the next president is for at least, it might even be a month. Okay, so keep on that. Pay attention to that, and it will be interesting to say the least. Okay, there will be lots to discuss, lots to talk about, and I'm sure there's going to be some twists and turns and some plot twists as we go through this. Okay, so be patient, let the process unfold, and just enjoy the ride. Okay, okay. So today's court case, Shaw versus Reno, 1993. It has to do with racial gerrymandering. Okay, before you get to that case, let me give you a little bit of background. I have a little example here, a hypothetical, and I'm assuming that my little state here, it's the state of Squarestan. It's becoming the 51st state of the United States. Okay, and just to make it nice and symmetrical, it's easier to explain this on a basic level here. Okay, so Squarestan has 3 congressional districts. Okay, and you can tell from this, Squarestan is controlled by the Democrats because they gerrymandered it to give themselves 2 seats and the Republicans only 1. Okay, so that's how they did it. And in this particular scenario, we are assuming it's the 2020 census, and in the next, when they're going to redistrict this, they have to they get another congressional seat. So gaining new seat after the census. So there's been enough of a population shift into Squarestan where they actually are awarded a congressional seat, and another state is losing one, but it's their gain. Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. Okay, there's this law. It's the, and I'm just going to give you the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Plays a factor here, especially, and I don't know if you guys can see, there's these little green dots in here, okay? And I did that to represent a minority that lives in that area. It can be any minority, okay? Just, this is where they are heavily concentrated, all right? So, according to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, in a state that has historic discrimination and racism, so our southern states, when there is a new seat, a new congressional seat for that state, or when they redistrict, if they are able to, they are required to provide a congressional district for a minority. So they're going to make a congressional district where that minority is the majority. So they call them minority-majority districts. All right, so in this new census, they are going to have to redraw these, and they're going to have to make it so this minority group right here is not divided among 3 different congressional districts. Okay, so I'm going to draw a new board on that, and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so here we are. We have the new redistricting. So the Democrats are still in control, so they have redistricted to still give them the advantage. So now they basically redistricted it, or gerrymandered it, the 3rd congressional seat, to give it to themselves, and the Republicans still only have 1. Okay, but you can see now the green area here where the minority was there. They created a district where that minority had a majority. Again, minority-majority. Okay, and so the whole idea of this is to make it a situation where a member of a race can elect someone from their race to Congress. And after this was passed in 1965, and then even amendments that were added to it later on, the one in 1982 has made it, especially after 1982, we started having more congressional districts that were set up as minority-majority congressional districts, and so we saw the increase of minority representation in the House of Representatives increase. Okay, so this was, and all because of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, one of the most successful acts ever passed by Congress. And so before we get on to Shaw versus Reno, which has to do with this, I'm gonna explain the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, before we get to Shaw versus Reno, that is the case about racial gerrymandering. I want to give you a quick tutorial on the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Okay, so remember, mid-60s, this is when we were in, the Vietnam War was starting to heat up, and we were right in full swing of the civil rights movement. Okay, and some very important laws were passed in the mid-1960s. First, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended discrimination in many places. Number 2, the 24th Amendment, which was ratified in 1964 and then ended what we call the poll tax. Okay, the The Voting Rights Act of 1965 passed a year later. The first thing it did is outlawed literacy tests. So literacy tests, poll taxes, and the thing called the grandfather clause, those were the Jim Crow laws that were designed to discriminate against African Americans and keep them from voting. Okay, so we systematically got rid of those, one with the 24th Amendment, the poll tax, and the Voting Rights Act a year later with the literacy tests. Okay, and so that was one thing it did. But more importantly and more impactful is how it was designed to register African Americans in the South. Okay, so registrars were sent to 6 southern states with a history of discrimination, the worst discrimination, and they were there to register as many African Americans as possible. Now, that would have been a dangerous endeavor before this. Okay, 1963, 3 civil rights workers went into Mississippi and they were kidnapped and murdered. Okay, famous case movie about that called Mississippi Burning. Highly recommend it. But this gave these workers more protection because they were escorted by U.S. Marshals, and there were stiff penalties and fines for in place for interfering with these workers. So how successful was this? Well, just to give you some stats, in 1964, the election of 1964, 43% of Southern African Americans were registered to vote. 2 years later, in the election of 1966, 66%. So it went from 43% to 66% of African Americans in the South were registered to vote. Okay, and so that meant that hundreds of thousands of African Americans were now registered to vote because of this simple law that was very effective. Okay, and so years later, in 1982, they added to this, and they said that in states, and these states in question where there is a history of discrimination, they had to work to create and provide minority majority congressional districts. So the example I gave you where they gained a new congressional district, if you're one of these states, you had to make all efforts to create a congressional district where there was a minority that had the majority there, and thereby they would elect someone to Congress from their race. Okay, and that has worked over time. It wasn't something that we didn't have a spike in African American representation, but we had more, and that was the whole point. Okay, so that provision of this law, the minority majority congressional districts, that's at the kind of like at the heart of this case, Shaw versus Reno, which we're going to talk about. And I'm going to switch to a Google Meet recording to help explain this a little bit better. All right, 1993. So what I need you guys to do, and you can pause your video if you need to grab your course packet, you need to turn to page 93. Okay, page 93. I'm sorry, did I say 93? I'm sorry, page 36. Page 36. This case happened in 1983. Okay. All right, we're on the top right, Shaw versus Reno, and the facts of the case, as you guys have them there. And this was led by a lady named Ruth Shaw, and she led a group of white voters in North Carolina. They challenged the state's new congressional district map, which had 2 majority-minority districts or minority-majority districts. Those are said both ways. If you see them either way, they both mean the same thing. They claimed that the districts were racial gerrymanders that violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Okay, so that's kind of like a if you think about what was happening here, it was almost like the group of white people were claiming, almost like you could say reverse racism. They said that it was going overboard, that now that there were too many majority minority districts or minority majority districts, and so they were claiming that their equal protection clause, their equal protection was being violated under the 14th Amendment. Okay, so this went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and how did they find? Well, here's what you want to fill in. This is what you have blank on your sheet on page 36. The Supreme Court of the United States agreed with Shaw's group that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment. The justices stated that race cannot be the main factor in creating districts. Okay, it can be a factor, but it can't be the main factor. Okay, so what happened is they had it was sent back down to the Supreme Court said this has to be considered, and so it went back to a lower court, the district court, and then the state had to uh, uh, redefine what they meant by how this was going to be redrawn and redistricted. So now notice a 5-4 decision is that means it's a divided court, and this could have gone either way. Okay, so let's go on. The reasoning, and this is always the most important. Again, it's a history lesson because you're learning about important Supreme Court cases, but in a political science class, you want to know, well, what's the reason? You want to know the why. So Supreme Court of the United States said that although the reapportionment plan was racially neutral on its face, the resulting district shape was bizarre enough to suggest that it constituted an effort to separate voters into different districts based on race. The plan seemed to exceed what was reasonably necessary to avoid racial imbalances. So they kind of went too far with how they redrew this district. So um, here's the district that they drew. Okay. So now notice it looks like um, there's a lot of just like narrow lines there. Well, those lines, a lot of those points where it's um, very thin, those are roads. So remember, like the Supreme Court has already ruled a long time ago that um, they have to be compact, like a congressional districts have to be compact, like in a designated area, and they have to be connected, or they use the word contiguous, which means continuous, I guess. And so notice how they connected it. It's all connected, but they spread it out. And so this was ruled basically unconstitutional because what they did is they went from community to community and drew the districts around primarily African American areas. Okay, and so they got enough, and so that was their congressional districts. So remember, the rule is one person, one vote. So all districts have to be equal size, and so they got it equal size, but they had to go up and down roads and very far apart to get one district, and it looked like this. So this is one of the most notorious congressional districts, by the way. Okay, and then the conclusion, and this is at the bottom, the second bullet point. This is where the Voting Rights Act of 1965 comes in. And it says, although the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the subsequent amendments in 1982, which we talked about, was one of the most successful federal laws ever passed, it could only go so far in requiring minority majority districts so as to not violate the equal protection of whites. Okay, so there's a balance. The law has to be followed to create minority majority districts, but it can't go overboard, and it can't be just based on to make more racially dominant, especially for minorities, congressional districts. Okay, and so just to um, finish this up here, I just wanted to show you guys these are America's most gerrymandered districts, and so you have um, the top 5, and then the one you would think the one we just discussed is one of the most, but I know it's in the top 10. But these are actual districts, and I think the one that we had, like I think these are the ones that are actually they were found constitutional, believe it or not. And you might think, wow, the one we just talked about, the one we just showed, um, was unconstitutional, and these are legit. So yeah, the District 3, Illinois, or number 3, Illinois, 4th District, they call that the earmuffs district. So a lot of these have names, I guess. So anyways, that's the end of the slideshow. What I'm going to have you guys do now, because you have some time in class, and if you're at home, this is just something to kind of get started on the next unit, which we're going to get into the presidency. So good timing, right? What I'm going to have you guys do is get started on Federalist number 70. And so you're going to read that. And this is one's by Hamilton. So now we've got a new author. The other ones we did were Madison and then Brutus. And so now we have Alexander Hamilton. So you can see, you can compare his writing style to Madison's. And I'm curious to know and get your guys' take on who do you like better, who writes better. So, but Federalist number 70, it's about the executive branch, very important um, paper, one of the most, and that's why the College Board wants you guys to read it. So we're going to do that. And then when after the exam, and well, we're not doing an exam, but after next week when I'm back, we'll get into the presidency and the executive branch full swing. But other than that, that's it. You guys have a good weekend. We'll talk to you soon.